Hello and welcome to AS Psychology revision on gender. First we have the psychodynamic approach. This approach assumes that gender development occurs in the phallic stage from ages 3 to 5. Before this, from ages 0 to 3, all children are bisexual, which means they do not have a distinct gender role. Gender development occurs by resolving the Oedipus and Electra complexes, by identifying and internalizing with the same-sex parent's gender. The Oedipus complex. This is where the male sexually desires his mother unconsciously, however he fears castration from his father. So, in order to resolve this complex, he identifies with his father and internalizes his father's gender role. The Electra complex is the same for women. Women experience, in the Electra complex, penis envy from their father. In order to resolve this complex, they turn their desire for penis into a desire for a baby, and thus identify with their mother and internalize her gender role. The psychodynamic approach to gender also assumes that both parents are needed for typical gender development, which means a mother and a father. However, few people accept the idea of childhood sexuality. As it's a rejected approach, it isn't likely to be used. There is also no evidence for it as it occurs in the unconscious, which means it lacks empirical evidence and is unscientific. It can't establish cause and effect because it uses case studies, which casts doubt on the theory. Evidence also shows that children younger than 3 have some idea of gender. This shows that the approach is inaccurate, so there may be a better explanation, for example the biological approach, which explains gender begins at birth. The Hetherington study supports the theory, because boys with no fathers were found to be less masculine and girls were found to be more awkward around men, which supports the assumption that both parents are needed for typical gender development. However, the Hofer study challenges this theory because it looked at the gender of children raised in non-typical households, for example, lesbian parents or single mothers, and found gender to be normal, which challenges the both parents assumption. Social learning theory of gender. Gender is learned by observing and imitating models you identify with, which makes it a nurture approach. These models must be appropriate and relevant, for example, the same sex, to be able to relate to them. Imitation also depends on 4 main factors: attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation. For example, a young girl sees her mother putting on makeup. She remembers how she does it and copies the behaviour because she wants to be like her mother. The imitation of the model behaviour is vicariously reinforced, such as praise for gender-appropriate behaviour. For example, the mother would say to the girl who put on makeup, "You look good in that makeup." A study which investigated this was the Cordura study, in which 5 to 6-year-olds were shown a film with reverse gender role jobs, such as a male nurse and a female doctor. However, it found that the children said the male was the doctor and the female was the nurse. This shows children learn behaviour and sexual stereotyping from models. This theory is supported by cross-cultural evidence, such as Mead, which found that gender was learned from the environment. There is lots of evidence for it, therefore it's more likely to be accurate, therefore more likely to be useful. However, it can't explain why same-sex siblings have gender differences, as they have the same model. Therefore, this is bad, as models mustn't be important, so they're not an agent of gender, so the theory is inaccurate. It also can't explain gender behaviours that have not been previously observed, such as the Laudette culture. This is bad, as it shows that behaviour is not all observation and imitation, and therefore the theory is inaccurate. It also doesn't explain changes in gender development, For example, 2-year-olds have different ideas about gender to 20-year-olds, which shows thought processes. This is bad as it shows we don't just learn from the environment, therefore the theory is not a full understanding of how gender develops. The cognitive approach to gender. The cognitive approach assumes that gender develops over time from ages 2 to 7 with thoughts, so it's a stage-based theory. Kohlberg's development theory assumes there are 3 main stages in gender development: identity, stability, and constancy. Identity occurs around age 2, where they can label their own sex, but they don't know that gender is fixed. Next is gender stability, which occurs from ages 4 to 5. The child knows their own gender is fixed, but the gender as others is based on superficial differences. For example, a man in a dress would be identified as a woman because he is wearing a dress. Gender constancy occurs at age 7. This is where the child knows all gender is fixed across time, despite changes in appearance. This time they know that the man in the dress would still be a man. Cognitive theory also assumes that gender schemas exist. Gender schemas are organised information about gender which will direct our behaviour. There are 2 main types: own sex schema, which is how your own sex should act, and in-group/out-group schema, how others should behave according to gender. The Damon study told children a story about George, who liked to play with dolls, and then it asked children aged 4 to 9 if it was okay for George to play with dolls. They found that the 4-year-olds said it was fine for George to play with dolls, the 6-year-olds said it was wrong, and the 9-year-olds said it was unusual, but fine. In conclusion, this shows that understanding of gender-appropriate behaviour changes with age. This shows that gender is learned through stages. There is also the pizza cutter study, where psychologists gave gender-neutral objects a gender. For example, a pizza cutter might be masculine. Then they let the children play with the objects, and they found that the children preferred to play with gender-appropriate toys. In conclusion, this shows that gender schemas exist as children played more with the gender-appropriate toys just because they were labelled a certain gender. The theory has cross-cultural evidence to support. This is good because it shows it can be generalised, which increases the reliability and confidence in the theory. However, the theory is descriptive rather than explanatory, because it doesn't say why gender develops. Therefore, another theory may be better, such as the biological explanation. It also can't explain different views of children, for example, girly girls versus tomboys. As it can't explain all gender behaviour, this makes it inaccurate or incomplete, and therefore this is bad as it's not very useful. The biological approach to gender assumes that sex equals gender. Sex and gender are interrelated. It assumes that gender begins at birth, which means it's innate and unchangeable. It also assumes gender is caused by biological factors such as chromosomes, hormones, and gonads. For males, this would be XY chromosomes, testes and penis, and testosterone. For females, this would be XX chromosomes, ovaries, and estrogen. Biological psychologists study individuals with atypical chromosome patterns such as Turner syndrome. People with Turner syndrome have XO chromosomes, which means their ovaries fail to develop, they have a webbed neck, and they have difficulty in social situations and poor math skills. Psychologists study individuals like this because if gender is biological, then atypical chromosomes will cause abnormal gender behaviour. Turner syndrome shows this is true, so it supports the biological explanation of gender. There is also the penectomized twin study. A boy was accidentally circumcised, and therefore raised as a girl. But during puberty, gender dysphoria occurred, and therefore gender reasserted itself, and he wanted to be a boy again. This supports the biological approach because the boy experienced gender dysphoria, which shows nature reasserting itself as he is biologically male. This shows gender is innate, as biology caused gender, so sex equals gender. There was also the Mr. Blackwell study. Mr. Blackwell was a hermaphrodite who was raised as a male but had female brain chemistry. But he chose to continue living as a male and got rid of his female parts. This challenges the biological explanation, as he had female brain chemistry, but he was raised as a male, so he continued living as a male. This shows gender is not innate, and sex doesn't necessarily equal gender. Biological approach ignores environmental/social factors. This is bad as it's not a full explanation, as it doesn't consider all factors. Studies such as the panectomized twin can only apply to one individual. This means it can't be generalized to everyone, which casts doubt on the evidence.